Hello again, everyone, and thank you for being with us. We got the last session of the day with Michael Pisarek talking about pragmatic governance for Microsoft Teams. Thank you, Michael, for presenting, and it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is well. I know it's a little bit late over there, so appreciate everyone being with me. I hope you had a wonderful day. Today, for the last session of the day, we are going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, governance, particularly for Microsoft Teams, because it's a really, really hot topic. And it's something, like I said, which a lot of organizations are struggling with. So I'm hoping that by the end of today's session, you're going to get a little bit of an overview. Here, let me remove this thing here. You're going to get a little bit of an overview in terms of what governance is and everything else. So we got a lot to get through, so let's get rocking and rolling here. If you want on the conversation with myself and Mike before, feel free to ask questions at any time. More than happy to stop and answer whatever questions that you have. Like I said, I know it's fairly late, particularly over on the East Coast. So like I said, feel free to chime in whenever we need to as well. Big thanks to the sponsors. Please go see these people. As someone who owns a product-based company, doing these virtual events can be a little bit difficult because you can't really get in front of people, right? So make sure that you go and visit some of these sponsors, visit their website. They're all good people. So a little bit about myself. So my name is Michal Pisarek. I will be with you here for the next 45 or so minutes. I have pretty long experience within SharePoint and Microsoft 365, 7 times Microsoft SharePoint MVP or whatever it's called now. I used to be the CEO of Bonsai Intranet. So we were one of the largest intranet in a box vendors. We got acquired in 2018. And since then started a new organization called Orchestry. So Orchestry is a governance, adoption, and lifecycle management platform for Microsoft 365. So we see a lot of customers and we do a lot with governance, in particularly around Teams. So we have a pretty unique perspective in terms of what's working and what isn't working out there for customers and for organizations, which I'm going to share with you. My claim to fame is I used to be a chef. So I'm a huge fan of cooking and culinary stuff and all of that. Once again, if you want to get in touch with us to know about Orchestry, just feel free to get in touch with me. Awesome product. Fills in a lot of the governance gaps I think that we're going to talk about today, but I'm not here to give you a sales job, so we'll just leave this here. All right, what are we going to get through today? So a bit of an agenda. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about some session goals. Just want to level set so everyone understands why they're here. It gives you a chance to parachute out as well. If you're thinking this is an advanced PowerShell programming course on governance, you're going to be sadly disappointed. But if you're after good pragmatic governance advice, you're going to be pretty happy. Then we're going to start to talk a little bit about the combination of strategy and governance together. So we'll talk a little bit around what does a governance plan involves, what are some of the things you should be thinking about, particularly from a strategic perspective. Then we're going to take it a little bit of a level down, and we're going to talk about what governance is in Microsoft 365 and in particular Microsoft Teams. There's a lot of options, a lot of knobs that you can turn in order to configure governance in the platform. One of the really confusing things is that it's really difficult to know where to start. So I'm going to talk to you about the top 5 things you should do if you're undertaking a governance approach on Microsoft Teams. And then the last thing around this, or most of this presentation, is what we're going to be calling pragmatic governance examples. So I don't like going to presentations. I'm not sure if where you're like, where you just see someone talking high level fluff for like an hour, right? It doesn't really make much sense. So what we're going to do, we're going to take everything that we learn in the first 2 bits, and we're going to pretend we're 3 different organizations, and we're going to look at particular governance examples and how you can implement that governance in lines of what those organizational governance policies are. So one of them is going to be called Lockdown Corp, which is going to try to lock everything down. One of them is going to be called Balanced Industries, which is going to go for a balanced governance approach. And then the final one is going to be called Startup Inc., which is going to leave everything very, very open. So we're going to go through these things. Some goals for you today, for everyone. So once again, the first thing is to really understand what governance is. It's a really big topic. I think the problem with it is that everyone has a little bit of a different understanding of what governance is. And if you talk to 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different answers. So really being able to level set and communicate what governance means to you is really, really important. Then we're going to talk about some of the out-of-the-box examples and some of the out-of-the-box features and capabilities that Microsoft provides you and what you can use. Then we're going to talk about some specific scenarios, right? And hopefully at the end of this session, you're going to have something to think about, but more than that, some things that you can actually go back to your organization and start to implement. So none of this is going to be custom code. There's going to be a lot of out-of-the-box capabilities here. But like I said, I'm hoping that these are things that you can take back and start using within your organization. Okay, so let's talk about the first thing, that link between governance and strategy. And it's really the first thing you have to look at. Really, from a governance perspective, your goal with governance is to provide that balance between end user adoption and the amount of risk that an organization wants to take. So before you start going in and changing settings and teams and going through all of those things, understanding what the appetite for risk is for your organization in terms of end user empowerment, in addition to kind of risk management, is really, really important. If we talk about governance in general, really governance is that process of defining the people, the policies, the rules, and the structure broadly in your organization, and then implementing that into Microsoft Teams. Before you start doing anything, you need to have some sort of governance plan, right? And a typical governance plan gets done outside of Microsoft 365, but it involves things like roles. So making sure you have different roles within your organization, IT end users, Azure AD admins, team owners, service owners, making sure you define responsibilities for each one of those roles, looking at the various types of processes that you're going to have as well. On the team side, the typical processes you're going to be looking around is definitely around teams creation, team archivals, what members can do, what owners can do, and all of those things, understanding access and ownership, and finally policies as well. So if you have policies around things like taxonomy, labeling, permissions, all of those things, you need to understand this broadly before you start going into teams and start changing things. Now, governance can help you achieve a lot of things. Typically, most of these governance engagements start with organizations to ensure compliance. So you might have particular rules that your organization might need to adhere to. They could be legal, they could be things like SOX, they could be social rules, they could be cultural rules also. But there's also a few other areas that great governance can help you achieve. The first is around adoption. So once again, we view, and I think you should view as well, governance and adoption of Microsoft 365 really as two sides of the same coin. They both work together. They both work hand in hand to help drive a particular outcome. But good governance can help drive great adoption, right? It can help streamline the process of creation, usage, and archival of content. You can use some of the governance capabilities to maybe disable or enable some features within Microsoft 365. And like I said, you can look at it from both lenses. The other big thing as well at the moment for a lot of organizations is helping you manage sprawl. Sprawl, duplication of content, people going in, creating 50 teams called human resources, for instance, and 10 teams called marketing and 14 teams called IT is a massive issue across organizations that we work with. Once again, good governance can help you manage that sprawl or stop sprawl before it happens by having something like a provisioning process or maybe limiting who can create teams, SharePoint sites, and groups. It can also help you with information leaks as well. So maybe you want to make sure you have governance around who can share, what people can share, and if you allow get guest access, and so a couple of other things as well, simplifying that end user experience and ensuring performance. The reason that it's so complicated for a lot of organizations is that there's no real right answer. And unfortunately, out of the box, Microsoft only provides you kind of two extremes, right? It's the very open, out-of-the-box capabilities where anyone can create anything. They can create teams, they can create groups, they can create SharePoint sites, planner plans, stream channels, whatever they want. This very open approach, which can work for some organizations, but typically doesn't. It's typically what happens where organization comes onto Teams, people just start creating teams like crazy because they don't really know what they're doing. And you get sprawl, you get duplication of content, you get a bunch of guests in there where you don't know where they came from. So it can be an issue. The other approach that the Microsoft kind of provides is a very tightly locked down process, right? Where you do lock down teams creation and you do lock down groups creation, and it has to go through some other process. Now, I don't think that either approach works particularly well for most organizations. There has to be a little bit of a balance, right? And the problem is that that balance really is going to be different for every organization. And this is where organizations struggle with governance, because you have to find out where that balance is for you. But what we see across all of our customers is a lot of customers start off with the out of the box kind of capabilities where it's very open. People can create anything. 6 months, 12 months, 18 months afterwards, they come back and they look at what they have and they say, oh my God, we have a massive mess on our hands. And they go back to a very tightly controlled mechanism. And that becomes problematic because users can't get what they want either. So like I said, not either approach works very well. So what you would typically get is something like this. So this is an example of one of our customers. Pretty typical example, pretty typical story, right? They launched teams. There wasn't really any launch. They're 12,000 people. People just started creating teams. They kept creating teams. But when we look into the data and the stats, we see it's a bit of a mess. Now, this is actually an example of a better client. We've seen much worse than this. But lots of teams with only the general channel. So people aren't really using Teams effectively. There's no additional tabs, no additional channels. They're definitely not going in and changing the SharePoint sites. They're only really using Teams as a way to get into their SharePoint files, right? So once again, not a good experience. Lots of teams with the word test, testing, demo, TST somewhere within the name, because someone goes in, creates a team. I call it Michael's lunch test, and that's kind of the end of it. Lots of ownerless teams, memberless teams. We typically see there's always a few people in an organization that love private channels, and they'll create a ton of private channels. And there's always one team for some reason in every organization where it has a ton of channels as well, right? So once again, these things don't necessarily work really well. Governance can help you make sure you don't get into the same state, and we're going to show you how. Now, Microsoft has done a really good job, particularly around the adoption and the governance side of things. If you are looking for some really great information and some starting notes, if you go to the Teams Adoption Hub, if you go to step 2, there's a governance quick start. It's a really good piece of content. It's very small, it's very simple, but it's a really, really great way to start if you want to start on that governance journey. All right. Strategically, let's say you've done that work within your organization, you've talked to your people, you understand what you want to do. How is governance actually implemented? What are the knobs and the whistles that you kind of turn to implement governance in Microsoft 365? Now, unfortunately, there's no governance center, right? There's a lot of different areas within Microsoft 365. It is a large platform, so you kind of have to go to all of these different areas within Microsoft 365 to get all of these governance options there. But overall, there is a kind of system or a formula that Microsoft uses across most of these. So essentially, there's 3 types of settings where you can configure governance within Microsoft Teams in Microsoft 365. It's at the team level itself, it's at the group level, or it's overall holistically in the security and compliance center. The nice thing is around most of these settings, particularly in what we call the Teams Admin Center, these settings, these policies can apply either globally or you can apply them to specific groups. So it gives you a lot of flexibility here. So you'll find if you go to the Teams Admin Center, you've got things like meeting settings and meeting policies. Think of it as meeting settings are going to apply to everyone, whereas meeting policies overwrite those settings for individual groups or individual users. What this does mean, though, it gives you a lot of flexibility, right? You can have a default setting for everyone, like a catch-all, and then you can also have individual policies that apply to certain groups of users in particular scenarios. So you've got lots and lots of flexibilities there. In terms of the controls, there is a ton of governance controls in Microsoft 365. This is really just a subset of these things, but you can control things like what apps people see. You can control things like what are the settings within Teams from a permission standpoint. What kind of naming policies? What guest access is there? What can external users do? What can people do in meetings? There's a lot there. And this is really where people get caught up. So if you were going to start with governance, what should you start with? So this is what we recommend. I think the first step is really around the creation process. It's typically the first thing. It's really the first thing because most organizations are in trouble with Teams and SharePoint sprawl. But the first thing to look at, and we'll look at this shortly, is who can create Teams, SharePoint sites, and groups, right? having a good provisioning process, understand what that is, can be really important. So that's the first thing. The next thing we would recommend is in terms of naming conventions as well. As you know, people don't name things the best at the best of times, let alone when they're stressed and pressured and want to create a collaborative workspace like a team or a Microsoft group. So having some naming conventions can really help you from a search capability, from a findability perspective as well. Luckily for us, once again, Microsoft provides some capabilities within this area in terms of naming policies and blocked words as well. The next thing you probably want to look at is around guest access. So guests essentially allow you to invite people external to your organization to collaborate within your Microsoft 365 environment. Obviously, it's a really popular thing, particularly around Teams, because one of the main use cases of Teams is bringing in other people from outside of your organization to work together. But once again, understanding, are you going to allow guests or not? Are you going to block, let's say, particular domains that guests can come from? So maybe you don't want people to sign up from a Hotmail account or a Gmail account, for instance. You can turn that on or off. You can manage who can invite guests. Also, there's lots of other capabilities around guest access. It gets a little bit complicated, but really you need to have an understanding of, are we going to allow guests in or not? Are we going to blanket allow them in or not? And also, do we want to have some sort of process around adding and removing guests also? And then the fourth thing as well is around expiry. So if we're creating all of these teams, we're creating all of these groups, what happens once they hit the end of life? So once again, there's some great features in Microsoft 365 around group expiry. And I use the words groups and teams a little bit interchangeably here, because these settings are on the group level, but as you know, a team is part of a group, so it applies to the team as well. But really your question around this is what happens at the end of life? So let's say we're doing or creating teams for every single project. What's going to happen once that project is finished, right? What do we do with that stuff? Do we just keep it there? What do we do with our guest users? What do we do with our members? What do we do with the SharePoint content through here? And then the last three, once again, are things you want to look at. So understanding some of the policies around retention, e-discovery, DLP is really, really important. We also find that the use of templates can be a really, really great thing. So from an adoption perspective and a governance perspective, instead of just allowing people to create blank teams and blank SharePoint sites and letting them kind of work it out for themselves, making sure that you have really, really rich templates available for particular business use cases can be really useful. And then finally, monitoring. So M365 has lots of monitoring capabilities. Unfortunately, like I said, there's no real one governance monitoring center within Microsoft 365. You're going to have to go to a fair few different areas, but there's lots of capabilities that help you understand what your users are using, how they're using the tool, and to identify any particular, let's say, governance challenges or adoption challenges. You are going to have to go to multiple different admin centers. Teams Admin Center has some reports. The SharePoint Admin Center has some reports. You're going to have to pull some out from the adoption pack. You can get that stuff eventually, or eventually. It does require a little bit of work, however, so there's not just a central kind of governance area. All right, so talked about a little bit about the strategic side. We've talked about how these things are implemented also. Remember, they're implemented with various policies or settings that are applied. How do we put these things together? So this is the fun part of the presentation here. Pragmatic governance scenarios. Now, what we're going to do here, we're going to do a little bit of a role play. So we are going to pretend that we're three different organizations. And the reason we do this is some of you are going to be working for a lockdown corp. Some of you are probably going to be working for a balanced industries. Some of you might be working for a startup Inc. So we've got three different organizations with three different needs. How can we configure M365 to these different needs within an organization? So the first organization we have is Lockdown Corp. Lockdown Corp is going to lean heavily to restrictive settings. I don't know, they work in PII and health data. They're going to essentially try to lock down as much stuff as they can, right, within all of these governance scenarios that we have. Balanced industries is who we wish every organization is, but typically isn't. They try to make that balance between end user empowerment and the risk that they're prepared to take. So any decision that governance, that Balance Industries makes, they're going to balance both the risk of IT and also the end user needs. And finally, we have Startup Inc. So Startup Inc. is a young company. They just got $37 billion in funding, right? They have beanbags everywhere. Their coffee machines are equipped with baristas. They're growing like crazy. They don't really care about governance in the same way as everyone else does. They want people to collaborate as quickly and as frictionless as possible. So what they're going to do is lean towards the open settings. Now, a note for all you good people here. A lot of organizations, you might be working for a lockdown corp, but you might be running your M365 or your Microsoft Teams environment as Startup Inc. And what I mean by that is out of the box, the default settings lean heavily towards Startup Inc., right? Microsoft wants to make this process as easy as possible for people, right? So we go to a lot of companies and they're very highly regulated, for instance. They think they have everything locked down, but because they haven't made any changes at all with Microsoft 365, they're actually functioning as Startup Inc. So it's something, like I said, to be really, really cognizant of and really important to note as well. All right, so let's go through our first scenario here. So let's talk about Teams creation. So the decision point here within your organization is fairly simple. Who's going to be able to create groups and therefore teams within your organization, and how are they going to be able to do it? Now, obviously, limiting teams creation is going to aid in sprawl, right? It's going to stop people from creating 20 teams called human resources, for instance. But if you're going to limit this, there has to be another way where users can go and request teams or SharePoint SharePoint sites. If this is locked down, there needs to be either a manual process. Maybe you're looking at a tool. Maybe you're writing a flow, a Power App, custom code, third-party tools. There's lots and lots of different options there. Typically, a lot of organizations also want something like an approval process, right, to be able to run as well through here. So once again, you can do this. Out of the box, your options are to implement this. You can essentially lock down who can create teams and groups within your organization. It does require some PowerShell. It's actually the only thing on here that does. Microsoft, I think, makes this as difficult as possible. But you can manage not just whether everyone or no one can create groups and teams. There's a little bit more granularity there also. So how does this apply to our three governance scenarios? So pretty simple. Lockdown Corp, they're going to disable the creation of teams through the native UI, and they're going to use, let's say, a Power App to be able to go and essentially do that process. Now, unfortunately, with the Teams UI, even if you go and, let's say, remove the ability for people to go and create teams or groups, that UI still makes it appear like you can. It's a little bit, I guess, deceptive, because if you can't create groups of teams and you can only add it to an existing team, you get this add to existing group thing. But if you can, you get a create a team icon as well. It does confuse people because people think that they can create them. They click on create team, and the only thing they can essentially create is they can add a team to an existing group. And if there's no groups that they can do that to, they get nothing appearing. So it's a little bit of a UI issue from the Microsoft side. But if you do have this disabled, that's the experience they're going to get. Now, Balance Industries is going down a little bit of a different approach, and I quite like this. So Balance Industries is going to lock down team creation in general. But what they're going to say is, listen, if you want to create a team, we're going to allow you to do that, but maybe you have to go through 10 to 15 minutes of training. So you understand what a team is and what it involves and what some of your responsibilities are. And then they move them into a group that has teams and groups creation enabled, move them into an Azure AD group. So it's a nice balanced approach, right? This idea, like I said, that maybe what you want to do is allow only a subset of people to be able to create groups and teams. You can do that as well. And Startup Inc., they're all good, right? So they're going to go and create anyone. This is the default approach. Like I said, anyone can go and create as many teams or groups as they essentially want through here. So Startup Inc. is essentially going to go down and going to go through that process and make it really simple. All right, now that we have the creation, what about naming? So teams naming policies or group naming policies. The decision point here is you want to make sure that enforce, you want to make sure that people are creating and naming things correctly, right? So your decision point here is you want to enforce some conventions in terms of how teams or groups are named. Now, as you know, groups and teams, or the names of your teams, can have a huge impact on findability. Luckily, Microsoft 365 also provides you with some capabilities to help with this. And there's two particular capabilities that Microsoft provides. The first is around what they call blocked words. So you can actually block people from being able to go and add a word as part of a team or a group name. I'll give you some examples of what those look like. So that's great. The other thing that Microsoft also has is what are called group naming policies. So what this is you can add things like prefixes, suffixes, as well as dynamic data from the person doing the request into the name of the group or the team itself. Now, these two capabilities require Azure AD Premium P1 licenses. Most people have these licenses anyway, so more than likely your organization does. But if it doesn't and you need to buy it, it is going to be an additional license there as well. So, blocked words. What are some of the words you might not want people to use? So for blocked words, there's a lot of things that you can configure. Here's some examples that we typically use. So things like people's names, right? A lot of people go in and create teams with their name in it. Michael's lunch test, John's test, all of that sort of stuff. You can block people's names in there, right? It can be really deceptive to see a name with like the owner, or see a team, sorry, with the name of the owner, of the CEO, or anything like that. So you can do that as well. The other thing typically that we find is putting privacy, like public, private, into the team name itself can be a little bit problematic unless it's part of a naming convention, because the privacy can change. So you can block this as well. Finally, blocking things like test, demo, TST, and temp can be a really useful thing. It's a really common thing for people to create teams called test and demo. You can make this available only for IT, where they can bypass that process, for example. The other things that are things like acronyms, right? A lot of people like using acronyms within team names. It could be a little bit problematic within your organization, so you can block those also. And finally, the other thing is blocking things like primary names, right? So if you have distinct names, HR, IT, department names, maybe you want to stop those names to be used. So if people go in and try to create another team called HR or IT or whatever else is, those are blocked as well. Now, in addition to that, you can also use those teams naming policies for things like prefixes and suffixes as well. So typically what we find with a lot of organizations is, from a governance perspective, some simple rules like prefixing teams based on the type or function, for instance. So all of your project-based teams are prefixed with PRJ or PROJ. All of your departments are prefixed with DEPT. If you work a lot with clients, maybe you have a client ID. For instance, if you're a law firm, you might have a client and a matter name. Committees could have COM. Classes for an education side of things can have CL. Having the ownership of the team as well can be something that's really, really useful. So having, marketing or HR or some sort of acronym within there can be really useful also. Location can be there as well. And I do have access within here, public, private, or guest access. Like I said, it can be useful in some occasions, but it might not be useful in others also. So some naming policies that might be really useful would be something like this. So like I said, project teams and sites, prefixing that with PRJ, a project ID, and the descriptive name, departments. We find a lot of organizations are also prefixing teams that have guest or external access enabled, so people understand that there's guests there. That can be a really useful thing. If you've got a multinational organization, having the geography, the business unit in there as well. And if you're a university, or this is one we took from Harvard, they have like the organizational name prefix, the department, and the descriptive name also. But it can make a huge difference. And on the left-hand side here, if I get out the old laser pointer, here, we've got some pretty decently named teams. They're not too bad, right? But just adding some prefixes and some suffixes really helps you understand what they're for. We know who the projects are. We know that these are department-based teams, and we know that these are maybe cross-functional based teams as well, right? So pretty simple things. But once again, just some simple naming policies can make things a lot easier. there is, like I said, that is available out of the box in Microsoft 365. If you want to get a little bit fancier, you're either looking at manual governance policies, or alternatively, you're looking at a third-party tool, a Power App, or anything else like that. All right, next thing that we're going to talk about, which is really important, is around default and available apps. So a couple of decision points here that you have. The first one is, A, what apps from the Teams App Store do we want to make available for our users? And then B, is there any apps or Teams apps that we want to default for our users? Now, as of the last count, there's something like 1,100 different Teams apps within the app stores, right? Some of them are going to be good. Some of them are not going to be so good. So like I said, by default, if you haven't changed any of these things, your users can essentially go and choose from that app store and add essentially whatever apps that they essentially want there. But you can control this also. The other thing that you can also control is, or you can pin to help users from an adoption perspective, is pin certain apps to the left-hand rail of Teams. This can be really useful, and it's becoming really, really popular, particularly with Microsoft Viva, because if you're deploying Viva, you can essentially pin Viva in the top left corner within your organization for everyone to see. But you can also do that with other apps, and remember that these policies can also be based on different groups of users. So you can even be as fancy as saying, well, for the marketing team, we're going to have these apps, which are going to be pinned for them. Whereas for the IT team, we're going to have these apps, which are going to be pinned for them by default as well. So you've got a lot of options through here. So the way that this is implemented is through 3 different things within Teams. This is one of the ones in the Teams Admin Center. You're looking at a bunch of different policies and settings. It's the app setup policy, the app permission policy, and also the org-wide app settings through here as well. So how are we going to implement this? So let's talk about Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp is saying, listen, we're not going to allow you to do any third-party apps. We're not going to allow you to add any personal apps either. We're not going to allow you to pin apps. Lockdown Corp's going to lock all of this down, right? So a third-party app is essentially an app that comes from the Teams App Store. A custom app is an app that's deployed by your organization. Now, the problem at the moment, particularly with limiting custom apps, is that Microsoft Viva is actually implemented as a custom app within your organization. So a lot of organizations turn this off, and then they realize they can't deploy the Microsoft Viva Teams app. So it's something to consider. But if you want to be Lockdown Corp and lock all of this down, you're going to turn off the org-wide settings for third-party apps and custom apps. You're going to go into the app permission policy, and you're going to disable all Microsoft apps, all third-party apps, and all custom apps. Now, this Microsoft apps disabling thing is also a little bit of a misnomer. It doesn't mean that people can't add any of the Microsoft apps. They can still add things like Word and PowerPoint and Excel and the OneNote app and the SharePoint app. They can still go and add those as tabs and as apps, but it's just a lot of the other Microsoft ones which are going to be removed. So things like Poly and some of the other pieces. And the other thing they're also going to do is lock down the app setup policy. So people can't actually change the rail on the left-hand side. They can't pin stuff. They can't upload custom apps. They can't essentially do any of that as well. So Lockdown Corp, if you want to go down this route, you can. Once again, very, very tightly locked down. Balance Industries is going to try to balance things, which is awesome. So what they're going to do is say, listen, we don't want you to have access to every single one of these 1,000 apps that exist within the Teams App Store. So we're going to kind of curate this experience for you. We're also okay with you adding third-party apps and custom apps. That's fine. But also what we want to do is we want to pin a custom app. Maybe it's Viva. Maybe it's a third-party tool for everyone to make it really, really easy. So what they've done, like I said, for the org-wide settings, it's kind of interesting. They've enabled, let's get the old laser pointer again here. They've enabled third-party apps, but they've disabled this. So this is a really interesting setting. There's a lot of subtlety here. There's always new apps coming up within the Microsoft Teams App Store. You can set up an org-wide setting to say, okay, we're good with the apps that are here at the moment. If there's any new ones, we're not going to add them by default. So that's what this setting does, which is pretty powerful. They're going to allow custom apps. They're good with the Microsoft ones. But these third-party apps, they don't want people to go in and choose from a list of 1,000 third-party apps. but they know there's third-party apps that the organization needs. So what they're going to do is they're going to allow the Adobe Creative Cloud, the Jira Cloud, and Stack Overflow here for Teams, and they've also got a custom app which they're going to pin through here. Really nice approach, right? You're kind of curating that Teams app store for people. You're still giving them the ability to add things, but it gives you that ability, like I said, a really nice balance between user adoption and the governance side. It's something that I would really, really consider. I don't think that having everything available is a good thing, like we said, or having everything locked down, but really work with your organization, understand the types of apps that you might want to allow people to have, and what you can do is give users the ability to add those as well as pin those as well. So what Balanced Industry would also do is for all of their IT folks, they would have, let's say, Jira and Stack Overflow for Teams, right? Pinned for them. And for all of their marketing folks, they would automatically have, let's say, the Adobe Creative Cloud pinned for them as a policy through here as well. So nice and easy. And then finally, we've got Startup Inc. So Startup Inc. basically wants to make all apps available, right? They don't know what their users want. They don't care. Startup Inc. is basically going to have everything open. Now, by default, like I said, and this is important, these are the default settings in Microsoft 365. If you haven't changed anything, you're essentially functioning as Startup Inc. within this. So you can go, users can add whatever apps, whatever third-party apps they want, whatever custom apps they want. They can pin, they can remove stuff. Like I said, they have a lot of flexibility here. You might want to go down this approach. Maybe you don't. But like I said, I'll keep talking about this point where if you haven't changed anything, you're going to be functioning as Startup Inc. here. All right, let's go through our third scenario. I know we're going through these, hammering through here, these a lot. Team owner and member settings. Once again, pretty important thing. Really, the decision point here is what are members of teams allowed to do? Now, owners of teams, unfortunately, you don't have that much control over. They can pretty much do whatever they like, which can be a little bit of an issue. But with members of teams, you do have a lot more control in terms of what members can do. So your considerations here are really how much power do you want your members to have in teams to do things like, create private channels, delete channels, add custom apps, right? Remove connectors, all of those pieces. In a lot of organizations, particularly those organizations that are new to teams, they want to go down the approach where your team owner is essentially a steward of that team, and what your members are going to allow to do is a little bit less. So you can actually control this as well. You can control this on a template by template basis and a team by team basis also. So you've got a lot of flexibility here that you can use. So talk about Lockdown Corp. So what does a Lockdown Corp want their team members to do? Well, it turns out they don't want their team members to do much, right? So that's basically what they have. So essentially, Lockdown Corp has disabled all of these member permissions. So a team member can go in, they can't add and remove channels, they can add documents and do all of those things, but they can't add channels, they can't add tabs, they can't add connectors. They can't even edit or delete their messages they have as part of a channel conversation, right? You can get pretty restrictive here. We haven't seen this happen often, but it does. Essentially, Lockdown Corp team members can go in, they can create conversations, they can't edit or delete them, unfortunately, so you better be really careful what you write. They can go and add documents, and they can basically use all of the capabilities that have been created for them, right? So you can really lock this down. Startup Inc. is going to be a little bit of a different approach, and I quite like this approach. So Startup Inc. is going to say that the team owner is responsible for the structure of that team. Think of the structure of that team as controlling the channels of that team, but they're going to allow members to essentially customize those channels by being able to add tabs and connectors, and also they're going to give them the ability to edit and delete their messages, which is really nice. But in this case, this is a pretty good approach. We know in a lot of organizations that use Teams or are new to Teams, members can sometimes go in, members don't understand what a channel is, they think it's only for them, they go and delete that channel, right? Which can be problematic as well. Or they create a private channel without really knowing what it is. For instance, you can control these items through here. So once again, this is a really nice balanced approach. Essentially, your team owner is kind of like the steward of that particular team, whereas your team member is essentially going to be going to be able to kind of work in the structure that's created by the owners. And then the last one is Startup Inc. So like I said, from a Startup Inc. perspective, these are the default settings, right, that exist in Microsoft 365. In this case, pretty much team members can do a lot of the things that team owners can do. They can create channels, they can update them, they can delete channels, they can create private channels if you've got that option available for them. So once again, you've got some kind of, you can have it very, very open, but you might have some governance challenges through here also. All right, final thing we're going to talk about is around Teams meeting settings. So a little bit off topic, I guess, away from collaborative teams, but just to kind of give you an example of how broad this area is. So for your Teams meetings, there's a ton of settings, but we're going to concentrate on a couple of things which we see organizations struggle with. And the decision point around Teams meeting settings is how should users be able to share content during a Teams meeting, and what should guests be, or what should guests be allowed to do during a Teams meetings. Now, this sounds pretty interesting, but a frequent kind of piece of data loss for a lot of organizations is you're in a Teams meeting, and I'm sure everyone's seen this, right? Someone's in a Teams meeting, they want to share something. They share their desktop. Everyone always shares the wrong screen, and on their screen is maybe their entire email, right? Or on their screen is a spreadsheet with everyone's salary on information on there, and people see that for like a split moment in time, right? You can actually control what and how people share within Teams meetings to secure that. The other thing is what guests can do. So if you've got guests coming into your Teams meetings, guests are going to be people from outside of your organization. You can also control exactly what guests can do during these particular meetings. So look at some of these options. So Lockdown Corp, surprisingly, is going to lock everything down. They're not going to allow anonymous users to join. They're not going to allow even internal people to share their screen. The only thing that a person within Lockdown Corp can do during a meeting is share a PowerPoint presentation. Right, that's the only thing that they can do. They can't use the whiteboard. They can't use notes. Right, they can't allow external people to have access. They're really locking that thing down. For participants and guests of the meeting, they're also locking that down as well. Right, so there's no meet now. There's no live captions. There's no chat in meetings either. Basically, if you're in Lockdown Corp, you're in a meeting. You're either talking to people or you're viewing a PowerPoint. That's essentially it. Right. Once again, that might work for your organization, or it might not. For balanced industries, a little bit more balanced. So for balanced industries, they're going to allow people to share, but they're going to allow people to share a single application, so we don't get into that piece where someone goes in and shares their desktop by accident, for example. So that's what they're essentially doing here. They're going to allow external users and some meet now pieces. They're going to allow chat and meetings also, which is nice. But like I said, they've done that little bit of a balanced approach. They've done a little bit of governance research to try to understand, what's going to be what's going to work for them and what isn't. And finally, we've got Startup Inc. Right? So Startup Inc. Like I said before, if you haven't made any changes within your governance policies, Startup Inc. is how you're running, even though your organization might be Lockdown Corp. Startup Inc. has all the defaults. So people can share the entire screen or individual apps. You can have a guest request control of your screen, for instance, right? Or even allow an internal participant to request control and kind of drive your screen through here. They automatically admit people. They let anonymous people start meetings. Pretty open, right? But once again, these are the open settings that you have. If you need to change some of these, you can. So, my friends, I know we have gone through a lot in this late hour here, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of at least where to start with Teams governance and some of the things that you can do. Now, there's a lot that's available here. So some things just to kind of finish up here. Think about governance like balanced industries, right? Balancing your end user needs as well as your governance policies, right? Don't maybe be like Lockdown Corp and lock everything down, but make sure that you kind of have that little bit of balance there. Also, just remember everything that I showed you through here, these are all out-of-the-box configuration options. You can go into the Teams Admin Center, the Groups Admin Center, you can change these things, you can change them back. Feel free to kind of change these. Be careful with experimenting also. You might have some side effects there, but you can change these things and these options at any time to make sure that it makes sense for you also. And like I said, the final thing is, don't just roll out Teams without doing a bit of governance planning and leaving these settings by default. Because if you are, you're running your Teams environment in a very, very open fashion, which might not necessarily be what you want it to be. So thank you all for your time, for sticking with us as well at this late hour. I know that there is prizes as well. So Mike, I know there's some prizes to give away, so feel free to go and click on this QR code to win a $50 Amazon gift card as well. And I'll turn it back over to Mike to see if there's any questions at this late hour here.
Thank you, Michael. It was great. Really always awesome to talk governance. No questions from the audience at all.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all, everyone. Mike, thank you for having me. Everyone, thank you for staying up at this late hour. I know. Like I said, if you have any questions within the future, feel free to reach out to me. I hope you all have an awesome day. And yeah, Mike, thank you for organizing this. I know it's a big deal as well. So I'm sure everyone appreciates it.
Absolutely. Thank you for presenting, and thank you everyone for staying with us all day.